Ian Bookman. Yeah. And she's been gracious enough to partner with us on these DxF office hours over the past year or so, where we do a little bit of content, some sort of deep dive on a data exchange framework, policy and procedure, or new topic, and then just really open it up for questions and discussion on what's on everyone's mind around the DxF. So if we go to the next slide. Just do a quick review of what the DxF is, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk about the privacy standards and security safeguards PNP. So you go to the next slide. Just really quickly, DxF vision. As a reminder, I know you all are pretty familiar who are on today, but our first ever statewide data sharing agreement that requires the exchange of both health and social services information. And if we go to the next slide, to kind of key tenets of the DxF are the data sharing agreement, the legal document that organizations across the state sign. We have about 4,000 something signatories to the data sharing agreement in California at this point. And then the kind of complement to the DSA, or the more detailed backbone, the policies and procedures, rules and guidance on a whole host of topics that guide implementation and that participants agree to abide by if they sign the data sharing agreement. So with that, Andrea, I'll pass it to you. Would love for you to introduce yourself first, and then we can talk privacy and security.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Stephanie. And always happy to be here. So as Stephanie mentioned, my name is Andrea Fry. I'm a partner in the San Francisco office, but recently moving down to San Diego of Hooper, Lundy, and Bookman. So we represent, healthcare providers, health information exchanges, health systems, kind of across the spectrum. And I do a fair amount of work within the data privacy, data sharing space. So working with Connecting for Better Health on the data exchange framework in these office hours has been really great. So today, just as Stephanie mentioned, kind of I think that really we're wanting to do a more deep dive into the privacy and security safeguards PNP understanding. I think that's where a lot of the kind of recent questions have been coming in to C4BH on this particular policy. Given the numbers, though, we really do want this to be kind of an open door session. So please feel free to interrupt me, pause me if you have questions. I tend to talk pretty quickly too, so if you need me to repeat something as well, please just ask. And so, just kind of diving in though, for the PNPs that have been issued to date by CDII, of which there are 15, and this has been kind of an iterative process since July of 2022, I believe, when the first set of 8 policies and procedures were released and finalized by the agency. And cover various topics like breach notification to info blocking prohibitions. And then again, kind of for our purposes today, the privacy and security safeguard requirements that participants on the data exchange framework are required to comply with. And so this particular PNP has gone through a couple rounds of revisions since it was actually one of the first set of 8 that CDI issued back in 2022, but I believe it's gone through 2 or 3 rounds of revisions. At this point, mostly just kind of to address participants' concerns around how, in particular, non-covered entities, non-business associates, non-hybrid entities were using, disclosing, or accessing health and social services information through the exchange. So let's dig into a little bit more of the meat of this policy. So next slide. Basically at a high level, and we'll get into kind of more of the detail in the next slides, but the purpose of the policy was to require participants to develop and implement appropriate privacy and security safeguards that really ensure kind of the confidentiality and integrity of health and social services information, which encompasses both protected health information as well as medical information under HIPAA and California privacy laws, in addition to personally identifiable information as defined by the Consumer Privacy Act here in California. So what does that mean as far as actual requirements? At a kind of basic level, all DxF participants, regardless of their status as a covered entity, business associate, or a hybrid entity under HIPAA, have to access, use, maintain, and disclose health and social services information in a manner that's consistent with applicable law. And if there's an authorization from an individual consistent with that patient's authorization. In addition to adopting and implementing various safeguards, for example, administrative, physical, and technical, and I'll get into kind of what that means more, to ensure the protection of this information and really prevent against breaches or unauthorized uses and disclosures. For those organizations that are participants and that are regulated as a covered entity, a business associate, or a hybrid entity under HIPAA, the policy essentially kind of boils down to this, that these types of organizations have to comply with their existing requirements under the HIPAA regulations. So under the privacy rule or the security rule, as well as for non-HIPAA regulated entities. So those are going to be, for example, certain community-based organizations and the like that aren't directly subject to HIPAA. The policy now requires them to comply with certain provisions of the regulations, which we'll get into. The policy also notes that, for participants who exchange or use or access behavioral health information that maybe is subject to more sensitive or more stringent privacy laws, either in California at the federal level, for example, the Lanterman-Petra Short Act with respect to certain mental health records, or the Part 2 regulations at the federal level with respect to substance use disorder records. In those instances where that type of information is being shared, the policy reminds participants that they do have to still abide by those heightened requirements beyond just HIPAA. Finally, the policy does impose specific requirements around having written privacy and security policies and procedures and workforce training requirements. These will look familiar if you are already, a regulated entity under HIPAA, but certainly are new obligations for non-covered entities, non-business associates, and the like. Next slide. So the policy is kind of organized in first by going over the privacy requirements, and then second by getting into the security safeguard requirements. And so kind of turning first to the privacy safeguards, as I mentioned on the last slide, really for HIPAA covered entities, business associates, and hybrid entities. And let me just pause here to explain also what a hybrid entity means. So for organizations, for example, that may have different components, I think an obvious example could be like a county that operates a hospital, but also operates a department that isn't actually providing healthcare services, nor is it providing services on behalf of the hospital covered entity, so it wouldn't be a business associate. In those situations, that organization can designate itself as a hybrid entity such that only the covered healthcare components within the organization as a whole are actually subject to HIPAA, whereas the non-healthcare components don't, if you've designated yourself as a hybrid entity, don't have to follow those same stringent requirements that HIPAA entails to the extent you receive individually identifiable information about the customers or the individuals you serve. Then for non-covered entities, and so for these types of regulated entities, to back up, the policy requires essentially at the end of the day that you have to comply with the privacy rule under HIPAA as applicable and any other kind of privacy laws that come into play, again, in the context of potentially sensitive behavioral health information and the like. The policy also reminds participants, if there is any conflict between the data exchange framework PNPs and your business associate agreements, reminder to review those and ensure that there is consistency. Then for non-regulated entities, it's kind of interesting. The policy breaks it out into two separate standards, one with respect to protected health information and one with respect to personally identifiable information. So for PHI, non-covered entities, non-business associates may not access, use, or disclose PHI that they receive from a covered entity or business associate participant, except with, for example, a valid authorization, or for very limited purposes, for example, basically kind of the general permitted and required uses and disclosures like treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. Still subject to the same prohibited disclosures. So for example, non-covered, non-regulated entities would be prohibited from using or disclosing the information for purposes of a sale of the protected health information, for marketing purposes, etc. It also obligates these non-regulated entities to comply with HIPAA's minimum necessary standard. And what I mean by that is, ultimately, when an organization is either using or disclosing protected health information, the minimum necessary standard obligates that organization to take reasonable efforts to really limit the PHI, either requested or disclosed, to the minimum amount that is necessary to fulfill kind of whatever the underlying purpose of the request or the disclosure or use for that PHI is in the first place. Finally, as far as non-covered entities, non-business associates with PHI, the policy also requires that these organizations comply with HIPAA's verification requirements. And what I mean by that is just in terms of ensuring, for example, the identity of a person or an organization requesting protected health information actually has, is who they say they are, has the authority to request this information, and whether that's, for example, if you get a request from an individual reviewing their driver's license to confirm, okay, this matches up with the information we have. So that verification obligation is now part of these organizations' responsibilities as well. Then for personally identifiable information, similarly, non-covered entities can't access, use, or disclose PAI, except if they're contractually permitted to do so or permitted by applicable law. They can only kind of in like with the minimum necessary standard, only access, use, or disclose PAI as necessary to achieve the intended purpose. And then finally, that same verification requirement applicable to PHI also applies to personally identifiable information for non-regulated entities. So next slide, assuming no questions. And then just kind of continuing on, I noted this in the overview, but the policy does have kind of this high level reminder to participants that, it's not just HIPAA, it's not just the Confidentiality of Medical Information Act in California, but it's also, for example, if you're dealing with substance use disorder records, 42 CFR Part 2 may apply, and in which case there are more stringent requirements, for example, around disclosures for treatment. It may be also the case that the California Consumer Privacy Act, or as amended by the CPRA, the Consumer Privacy Rights Act, applies. Most likely, a lot of the participants on the exchange, though, will not be subject to the CCPA, CPRA. And I say that because it only applies to for-profit businesses in California that do business here in the state and have a gross annual revenue of 25 million or more, and a couple other thresholds, for example, like buying, selling, or sharing the personal information of 100,000 or more individuals, or deriving 50% or more of their revenue from the sale of personally identifiable information. But in any case, if you did fall into one of those buckets, a reminder that the CCPA, CPRA requirements would apply. And then for as far as sensitive health information, there is also a reminder that for abortion and abortion-related services information, as well as for gender-affirming care information, that participants should only exchange these types of records if it's permitted or required by applicable law. And I think that kind of brings up, for example, and I know Connecting for Better Health has done a few segments on this too, AB 352, as well as the recent amendments to the HIPAA privacy rule around safeguarding the privacy of reproductive health information. And so, for example, to the extent there are requests from an out-of-state individual organization for an abortion related services information, in that case, these types of laws would impose heightened requirements around whether or not that information may or may not be shared. Finally, in just basically tracking with the de-identification standards under HIPAA, the policy does require, if a participant is using or disclosing health and social services information in a de-identified fashion, that the de-identification process has to comply with either the safe harbor method under HIPAA or the expert determination method, or more stringent law if applicable. Next slide. Okay, so we covered the privacy safeguards. Now we kind of just flip over to the security requirements. And again, as a reminder, every single participant of the data exchange framework, regardless of whether or not you are a regulated entity under HIPAA, has to develop, implement, and uphold various safeguards, administrative, physical, and technical, as well as controls that really fundamentally are intended to protect the confidentiality of HSSI, ensure that there's a secure environment to facilitate exchange, as well as to protect against unauthorized uses or disclosures, losses, destruction, or disruption of access to HSSI. For organizations or participants that are regulated by HIPAA, the policy requires that they comply with the security rule, as they are already required to do so under HIPAA, as well as any other applicable law. And similarly, again, just a reminder, if there is any conflict between, your business associate agreement and the policies and procedures, ensuring that that is consistent with the data exchange framework. And then for non-covered entities, non-business associates, the policy requires that they implement appropriate administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, but only with respect to certain requirements or certain sections of the privacy rule. And so these include, for example, around having technical infrastructure in place, hardware and software security capabilities, conducting, for example, security awareness and trainings, having business associate agreements, implementing facility access controls with regard to physical safeguards. So, for example, with cell phones, having device and media controls, or having two-factor authentication, if that's a reasonable security measure that can be taken. And then as far as technical safeguards, ensuring that any emails containing HSSI are encrypted, for example, or having unique user identification prior to, allowing access of any systems that may contain or, through which HSSI may be accessible. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap up here, the last couple pieces in the policy focus on, as I mentioned, the policies and procedures that organizations are required to implement, as well as the trainings. And then also for secure destruction, the policy does require, if, for example, there's an inadvertent receipt of health and social services information from another participant, that there has to be a secure destruction of that information as soon as possible, in addition to basically just notifying the other participant that disclosed that information in error, like, hey, you accidentally sent us this, we're gonna make sure that it's securely destroyed, but you may need to review your potential breach notification requirements to see if they are applicable here. As far as the privacy and security policies and procedures, again, this is not any substantive change from what HIPAA requires, but the policy does, again, for non-regulated entities, though, that this will be a significant change, and that participants have to have written privacy and security policies and procedures. And these need to be reviewed and updated as needed and no less than annually. I think just to ensure that there is operational consistency and compliance with the applicable law. And then as far as training, the policy does require each participant to train staff, contractors, employees, essentially any members of their workforce around the kind of appropriate, or excuse me, the applicable law governing how health and social services information may be accessed, used, or disclosed in a manner that complies with both the data exchange framework policies and procedures and applicable law. And that does need to be targeted towards, and kind of an appropriate role-based information training. So for example, it may differ if you're, for somebody who has access to more health and social services information and whatever functions they're carrying out, it may be the case that a more thorough training needs to be conducted, for example. The policy also includes refresher training requirements. Each participant under the policy has to provide these refresher trainings no less than annually. HIPAA, that is a change from HIPAA. There isn't any, other than conducting routine trainings, there isn't that same kind of annual requirement, but certainly that's a best practice and one, I think that's generally advisable. Finally, the policy does require, does have a record retention requirement just around the conduct of trainings. And so whenever, you are conducting those trainings, those records need to be stored for at least 6 years. Or if there is a longer period required by another law in compliance with that other law. And so I think that wraps up my overview of the policy and procedure.